Ah, yes, the 1970s. Right after the sexual liberation of the 1960s, and right before AIDS put an end to free love. Right after the political awakening of the 1960s, and right before the oppressive conservatism of the Reagan-Thatcher-dominated 1980s, you'll find a sweet spot in the middle where decadence and pleasure were worthy of pursuit and not things to feel guilty about. Yours truly, Curmudgeons, were born smack in the middle of this decade, putting us at the tail end of Generation X. Much has been written and said about the great, groundbreaking, innovative albums of this period and the overflow of genres that still define much of today's music. But it was such a fertile period that there are countless albums that have been more or less forgotten as time has passed. Don't fret, folks. The Curmudgeons are here to correct that oversight. On this episode, we present to you the 20 most definitively underrated albums of the 1970s. Welcome to the 29th edition of the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Welcome, everyone, to the 29th edition of the Curmudgeon Rock Report. This is Christopher O'Connor coming to you from suburban Houston, and with me, as always, is Arturo Andrade coming to you from Gwangju, South Korea. And we host a podcast made just for you. We don't do hot takes, we do honest takes. So then this belongs to you. Well, who are you? You are the rock geek iconoclastic outsider looking for safe haven in a world where rock no longer predominates. Well, it sure as heck does here on the Curmudgeon Rock Report, where we not only celebrate this music, we live it in its full majesty and in its full color and at full force. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some stuff you never knew before, probably more from Arturo than from me. And now you can join our new invite-only Facebook group, which we call the Curmudgeon Rock Report's Curmudgeonly Community. Join us and share thoughts, musings, and random excitement with fellow travelers along the curmudgeonly path to rock and roll goodness. So, Arturo, I seem to recall at the end of the last episode that we promised folks the top 10 most underrated albums of the 1970s, but now we're at 20. What happened?
What happened is that I came to the realization, and I think you as well did, that dude, the 1970s was such a great decade for music. There are so many great albums and unsung and unheralded albums, just as much as the classic heralded and sung albums, that we had to increase it to 20. We just had to.
Yeah, which makes sense because I challenge our listeners out there, the Mikes and the Dennises of the world, and the Lees of the world, actually. You try limiting a list like this to 10 records.
Exactly.
Really, really hard, and it will actually, as an intellectual exercise, will be quite agonizing. Well, with that said, folks, before we go to the 1970s, we need to go to the other side of the space-time continuum. Here we are in the parallel universe, where we like to say green is blue, up is down, and the musicians and rock stars that deserve the stadium love and the praise of the mass intelligentsia and of all the real people and the little people out there actually do get that love. And so here we are again. This is a segment in which each of us reviews a newly released album from a contemporary artist that each of us is vibing in this here 2-week period. That said, Arturo, what are you bringing with you over here to the Parallel Universe this week?
It's fitting that we're doing an episode of 1970s albums, because my recommendation is a hip hop album very rooted in 1970s funk and R&B. Now, this album came in at number 13 on my list of best albums of 2021 from last year, and it is my choice for the second best hip hop album of the year after another album that I reviewed on this podcast, Genesis Owusu's Smiling with No Teeth. This album is by Topaz Jones. It's called Don't Go Tellin' Yo Mama. This album is a rarity in contemporary hip hop, whether it's mainstream or underground, in the sense that it is a hip hop music album that you can, God forbid, actually dance to.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, hip hop to dance to. How about that? Yes, it's funky, it's groovy, it bumps, it grinds, and it flows just as well in a dance club as it would in a bedroom. Firmly rooted in 1970s funk and early 1980s R&B, not too far removed from the smooth Minneapolis sound that birthed Prince, and brimming with jazzy undertones. It comes off like a sly hybrid of mid 90s A Tribe Called Quest and the restless magpie tendencies of Kendrick Lamar, circa To Pimp a Butterfly.
That's a good call, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a rapper, Jones isn't really anything unique, but he does have an engaging flow that slips in nicely with the super slick beats, and his witty lyrics eschew that macho gangsta bullshit of a lot of mainstream hip hop artists for more socially conscious fare that's really rich with autobiographical details in his narratives. Standout tracks, the irresistibly smooth yet P-funk groovy D.I.A.L, the heavy ass bass funk of Baba 70s, and the psychedelic swirl of Blue. So, if you are sick of moody, mellow, ethereal, droning synths, sad sack hip hop, and want some funky soul for your hip hop stew, Topaz Jones, Don't Go Tellin' Yo Mama is yo jam.
Well, there you go. The pride of Montclair, New Jersey, is Topaz Jones. It's worth noting that this record has an accompanying 35-minute mini movie that accompanies to it, which I believe you can find on YouTube.
Sure.
He's a pretty compelling guy in the sense that, like you said, yeah, he does lean on the funk and some of the more traditional sounds and grooves. Like you said, there clearly some JD Q-Tip influence in the bottom end, but he also he tends to be more thoughtful. He's got a lot of wordplay. Some of it is really clever, some of it is borderline Kanye inducing. But at least he's working on it. Some folks might remember, and I. In the course of researching this episode, I remembered this. I didn't know it was him, but there was a single that hit some of the urban radio stations about 6 years ago called Tropicana, which it's almost like a West Coast, like kind of laid back vibe to it.
Yeah.
But it's not quite funk and it's not quite soul, like kind of New Jack soul. But it's in some ways it's almost trap housey with the sort of the space that goes in it. But it's a fun little summer jam. So he does have some musical chops. But I'm impressed with this album too. And it's actually called, just for the sake of being not being overly ebonic, it is called "Don't Go Telling Your Mama." Not yo mama, although it's definitely more fun to say yo mama, but for all of you English purists out there, it is your mama,
right?
So good choice. And now we go maybe not 180, actually in some ways it's not quite 180 degrees this time. Welcome back to the never-ending travels of King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. This is now over the course of these almost 30 episodes of this podcast, I have become our resident King Gizzard scholar. And now I have the pleasure of introducing you to a third record by this band, again, since the beginning of the Curmudgeon Rock Report. They definitely are the most interesting of the new awesome wave of Australian bands. that are making a dent in modern rock and roll. Now, they're not only one of the most prolific rock and roll bands in the world right now, they're certainly one of its most fearless. They have the confidence to literally try anything. They've released, what is it now, 21 records in 5.5 years or something like that?
I don't know if it's that many, but it's quite a bit.
Yeah.
I can tell you right now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is their 9th album since 2017.
Yep, I got you.
Yeah.
And so this is their third release in the calendar year. So as a brief review, last year they had 2 albums. The first one was the latest in their series of microtonal prog rock albums. That one was called LW. And then they did a beguiling and appropriately themed dream pop record called Butterfly 3000. I'm a bigger fan of the latter than I am of the former, which I know you disagree with.
Yeah.
But be it as it may, now here in February of 2022, we are getting a really weird curveball, even for King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Made in Timeland is the name of this record. And it finds the band channeling The Orb, Aphex Twin, and other EDM artists of yesteryear. Yes, really, we're talking about hardcore EDM King Gizzard at this point. Now, according to various press reports out there, this album was intended as a one-time pressing or one-time only pressing of 2,000 vinyl copies or so to be distributed to attendees of the band's scheduled New Year's Eve show in Victoria, Australia, billed as the Timeland Festival. Well, unfortunately, the worldwide tidal wave of Omicron-related COVID-19 infections forced the band to cancel that festival. However, just a few days prior to the recording of this year's episode, Made in Timeland found its way onto the internet. Not sure if that was in an official or an unofficial capacity, but hey, it is out there. It is the talk of many as a Reddit board. There are lots of sites that have it available. It's not officially on Spotify, but there are playlists that capture it. So it's kind of cool. It's kind of the equivalent of an old unannounced fan club release that's been dropped on the world.
Right.
So now let's describe this thing. It consists of 2 movements called Timeland and Smoke and Mirrors. I'm calling them movements rather than songs because one, they're instrumental, but they also do seem to be 2 parts of a whole, wishy-washy as that whole may ultimately be. This is a 30-minute blast of electronic soundscapes that oscillate between spooky and actually quite lovely. At times, the music veers heavily into Aboriginal musical territory and influences. Didgeridoos, or at least studio console simulations of the indigenous instrument are there. So are clapsticks. If the vibe here is supposed to be tribal, well, that is one credible way to do it. Like other King Gizzard works, Made in Timeland can be deemed more of an experiment than an actual album. There's not much cohesion despite evidence of a motif or 2. I think Stu McKenzie and his bandmates are really just having fun turning knobs and discovering what may come out of the console as they do turn those knobs. And I hope that this does serve as a precursor to a real, fully realized King Gizzard album in the months ahead. That would be pretty cool. One final thought. At this point, it's fair to start asking, so when do we get the reggae album from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard? Somehow I think they might pull that off. Oh, and as one other thing to offer, I saw it was a Reddit chat that someone was speculating, and I don't know if this is true or not, that the music here was intended to be the PA music between sets at the festival, which I could totally see.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah. But anyway, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, when are we getting the King Gizzard Fish style jam band album?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, widespread panic as channeled through King Gizzard.
Yeah. The more I listen to this album, the more I like it. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. But I think this is a way, way, way more interesting excursion into electronic music than Butterfly 3000. Whereas Butterfly 3000 to me was just lightweight, middle of the road, derivative, wannabe Kraftwerk crap. This actually seems more like an original piece by a band trying to do something original.
Yeah. That's a fair point.
I mean, to me, it's two 15-minute tracks. Both are multi-section songs, sometimes 6 sections, 3 sections that are the same motif. Yeah, of course. Where do you find that? You find that in classical music. But who cares about classical music? Where do you find that more recently?
EDM.
Ambient techno, more specifically, especially 1990s style ambient techno, and that's why I draw the Orb comparison more than Orbital or any of the other pioneering UK electronic groups or artists of that era. Heavy on the Orb. Heavy. I would say this album is 70 to 75% really groovy ambient techno. And then of course, interspersed with like really weird guitar and piano instrumental stuff.
At one point there is that it for about 25 seconds it actually like turns into like a guitar jam, or like this like kind of weird punk riff thing comes there. In the middle, and then at one point it kind of goes like super duper drum and bass.
Yeah, I mean it's weird, but it's engagingly weird or weirdly engaging, however you want to express it. With repeated listens, I think it makes more sense. Do I put it up there with King Gizzard's best work? No, I don't.
No,
but it is good. It is solid, and I would like to see an album of songs. Plucked and molded, plucked then molded from this kind of sound. It'd be cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my main takeaway is I really want them to do like a pure Orthodox Aboriginal record, because that's the coolest stuff in the whole thing. Right. Is whether it's a real didgeridoo or a simulated one, and the clapsticks and all that. That stuff is really cool, and the Winwoods and all that. So I would love to hear them get a record out of that. I mean, I know that they've done some like kind of unusual instrument stuff, and I know they've done some stuff that's like native to sort of Australian sounds in the past. I mean, I've heard Stu McKenzie talk about that in interviews, but I would love to just Aboriginal music is just cool anyway. But I would love to hear the King Gizzard filtered version of Aboriginal. That'd be pretty wild. We leave the parallel universe and we go back to those swinging ass 70s. Arturo, set us up.
Yeah. As of late, our fellow curmudgeonly listeners and Chris, as you know, this podcast has been on a hot streak with the notion of underratedness being the running theme. On our last episode, we defended the greatness of Metallica's unfairly underrated Saint Anger album. On the previous week, we analyzed the work and the legacy of the criminally underrated folk rock duo Richard and Linda Thompson. Well, Richard and Linda started their immaculate run of albums in the mid-1970s, so we decided, hey, let's take that theme of underratedness and extrapolate it to an entire decade. The 1970s are, in our righteous opinion, undoubtedly the second most important musical decade of the 20th century, the 1960s being the first, of course. So much new ground was broken in so many genres of music, and in some cases, new genres were invented along with subgenres within the old and true, tired and true genres of rock, country, R&B, and soul. Much has been written about the defining albums of this decade, but there are many equally deserving of praise that have unfortunately slipped through the cracks of critical history. Well, damn it, we're here to correct that error. Today, yours truly, Curmudgeons, will present the definitive list of the 20 most unequivocally underrated albums of the 1970s in the patented countdown fashion that we used to utilize in our earlier episodes. So, everybody, break out those bell-bottom jeans, that lava lamp, and that freshly rolled spliff with a high-grade weed. If disco dancing is more your jam, break out those polyester pants, break out those extra wide collared shirts, your Coke spoon necklace, and roll out that mirror table full of freshly cut cocaina and blast back to the past as the Curmudgeons will guide you through the classics of that period that should be remembered more today as the all-time greats that they are.
Your resident Curmudgeons recently switched our hosting platform to Podbean, and what a move it's proving to be. For the equivalent of $9 a month, we get quality, reliable hosting that allows us to distribute the Curmudgeon Rock Report wide and far to all the places where you find all of the other podcasts. We also get to customize a pretty good website. Visit us at curmudgeonrock.podbean.com. And we also receive some excellent statistics that tell us when and how you listen to this here creation. Most importantly, Podbean is its own community of podcasters and opens us and you to some pretty incredible music podcasts besides this incredible one. We urge you to especially check out History in 5 Songs with prolific writer Martin Popoff and Song Exploder, which expertly guides listeners through the making of a great pop song. Podbean, it ain't bad.
So, before we go into the 20 most underrated albums of the 1970s, let's briefly, and I mean very briefly, mention 10 albums that missed the cut. In some cases, barely missed the cut. And Chris, well, let's start with the first one.
Okay, so we start with Black Sabbath's Sabotage from 1975. This is the last really good, I think great album from the Ozzy era of Sabbath. After that, they went in the shitter. Really strong, kick-ass record, like obviously the big-ass riffs, but also the first hints of the LA metal sound that Ozzy would popularize 6 years later or so.
Yeah, I agree. This is the last good Sabbath album, period.
Well, there you go.
And we also covered this album many episodes ago in our Vault segment. So, we kind of like already did this album to death a lot. We both love this album, but yeah, we had to put it on the cutting room floor.
Yep, and same thing with the next album, which is the Rolling Stones' It's Only Rock and Roll. We covered this in our Charlie Watts Memorial Edition of our Vault a while back. We both love this record. Dance Little Sister Dance will always be an anthem for us. I mean, that's a great shower. That's one of the greatest shower dance songs ever made. If you just want to swing your dick in the mirror and have some fun with that. And that's their last album with Mick Taylor. That's the first album that they produced, Mick and Keith as the Glimmer Twins, and they set the template right, and it was basically a perfect, really strong, just rhythmic rock record. It was a template that they would do nowhere near as well.
Right.
Moving forward.
And, it's the album that concluded that amazingly hot streak from the late 60s to the mid 70s that proved that the Stones could do American rock and roll better than any American rock and roll band ever.
Yep.
Another band that we had to put on the cutting room floor. This was one of Chris's selections. The Guess Who, Share the Land from 1970.
Yep. In which this is the first band of the guy that brought us Taking Care of Business. Yeah. The Guess Who has its profile in classic rock realm. Western Canadian band. They're more well known for the two albums, and this is going to be a theme throughout this episode. The album before Share the Land and the album after, which are Wheatfield Soul and American Woman. Yeah. This does have a couple of staples on it, including the title song. They did a really neat feat on this record, which they combined the British invasion of the Kinks and the Beatles with the Topanga Canyon stuff, folky stuff of that era, and just really strong songwriting. Burton Cummings, awesome singer, collectively great songwriters. Just a very earthy album, and Share the Land is one of the better phony Dylan songs of the era.
I mean, they were arguably the first great Canadian rock and roll band.
Yeah, absolutely.
The band before them.
Yeah,
then the Guess Who.
That's true. It's like 4 Canadians and a dude from Arkansas. So that said, Arturo, tell us about Curtis Mayfield's Roots.
Yeah, Roots is the album that came out in 1971. When people think about Curtis Mayfield, they go, especially the most recent Rolling Stone magazine 500 greatest rock and roll albums of all greatest albums, not just rock and roll, greatest albums of all time. Curtis Mayfield had 2 albums in there, justifiably so. His first album, Curtis, from 1970, that's the one that has "If There's a Hell Below, We're All Going to Go." It's also the one that has "Makings of You" and "Move On Up" and "Miss Black America," and of course, 1972, the Superfly soundtrack, which, if you don't know, you should be ashamed of yourself for not knowing.
Yeah.
It's got Pusher Man, Freddie's Dead, the title track, Superfly. But
Yeah,
one that gets, go ahead.
The greatest soundtrack of ever made.
Maybe, quite possibly, yeah. But the one that gets lost is the middle record there, called Roots from 1971, which is a fantastic, perfect record on its own right. It just takes what he did on the first album, Curtis, and he just refines it. Get Down, Keep On Keeping On, We Got to Have Peace is just one of the best anti-war anthems ever, and pro-civil rights songs ever. It's both in one song, which tells you the towering brilliance of this guy and what he was. But we had to put it on the cutting room floor because there are other albums that we thought were more underrated than this one.
Gotcha. So next, Hearts, Dreamboat Annie from 1976. Yes, really. So in the 1980s, sisters Ann and Nancy Wilson sold out and spiked MTV with a series of insipid pop songs. Which is too bad because, yes, these are the women that brought you Crazy on You and Magic Man, which are the 2 forever classic rock radio staples that highlight Dreamboat Annie. They also did Little Queen, I think a little after this, that has Barracuda on it. But this record is a kick-ass rock and roll band from female-fronted band, which was pretty rare in the mid-'70s. And so they deserve their props.
Yeah, but we had to put it on the cutting room floor because I don't love this album, but I do love the radio staple singles. Another album that I love that we had to put on the cutting room floor was Neu, and the way it's a German name, the way you spell it is Neu exclamation point. Neu were one of those many great 1970s bands from the unfortunately titled krautrock movement. They were basically a German progressive rock electronic hybrid band that were very influential, really, really inspiring to a lot of bands, and like their influence didn't really come through until like 20 years later. But they were one of the great ones, and this was their 1975 album Neu 75. Neu were a huge influence on artists in the late 70s, particularly people like, the stuff Brian Eno and David Bowie were doing, the Berlin Trilogy.
Yeah, I was going to name drop that too. That Low especially owes a debt of gratitude to Neu.
Yeah. I mean, arguably Neu and Kraftwerk were the 2 most important German bands of the 1970s, and Neu 75, in my opinion, is their best album, but on the cutting room floor. Next, Chris, the next one.
Yeah, Neil Young's Comes a Time. Underrated in the sense that once in a while, he started this with Harvest. Neil, sure, he went in the ditch after Harvest, but once in a while he realized he actually needed to make some money. And so he would make these really clean, really great country-ish rock records with these really sharp, very well-written pop tunes and country-ish. And so here we find him harmonizing with Nicolette Larson. There's a couple of really nice middle ground Crazy Horse tracks. Lot of Love, his version of Lot of Love is on this record. It bridges it comes right before Rust Never Sleeps, and he did this not quite as effectively, but made a lot more money with Harvest Moon 14 years later. But so this is kind of the one, the second of 3 of those records again that I think is it's my favorite of the 3. I like it more than Harvest, just personal tastes.
Yeah, Comes a Time has probably one of the 5 or 6 greatest pure pop songs Neil ever wrote with Lot of Love. Not Whole Lot of Love, just Lot of Love.
Yes.
And that and the inclusion of that song, and I think Neil's version is way better than the
Nicola
woman
Larson's,
who had a huge hit with that song. And that the inclusion of that song is enough to make this a super underrated record that should have or could have made the cut. But man, there were so many others that we had to leave this one out. The next one that we left out, okay, it's Townes Van Zant's Delta Mama Blues from 1971, but it isn't so much about this album as it is about Townes Van Zant's entire repertoire and his entire discography. In my opinion, he is the second greatest country music songwriter who ever lived after Hank Williams. Yes, I think he's better than Willie Nelson. And quite arguably the second greatest American lyricist of all time after Bob Dylan. And that's saying something.
Yeah, it really is.
Townes Van Zant had a streak of albums in the late 60s, early 70s that are just impeccable, awe-inspiring, heartbreaking, and heartwarming all at the same time. Delta Mama Blues is maybe one of the 2 or 3 best of that streak. And there's so much greatness in this, and underrated for his influence on a lot of the Americana alt country movement later on. But because it was so hard to pick a great Townes Van Zant album because they're all so good, we had to leave it off.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I think a lot of us in Gen X and the millennial era, our introduction to Townes was the use of his cover of Dead Flowers in The Big Lebowski. Yeah. Which is unfortunate because, it's a wonderful cover. But, Townes' own stuff is pretty awe-inspiring. And he's one of those guys. There's like a tradition that pretty much started like turn of the century when you and I were living in New York, where like all these dead guys that didn't get much credit back in the 70s and early 80s, all of a sudden built a cult following among the young ones.
Right.
And it's still growing. So I think Townes may actually end up being like a super duper star by like, 2050?
I hope so. He deserves it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay,
next one. 180 degrees opposite of Townes Van Zant.
No shit. Candy O by the Cars. Now, after 1978's debut record, The Cars, lots of bands wanted to be the Cars. And they sure tried. And then the Cars released Candy O, and they made everybody realize they can't actually be the Cars. Yeah. This is a good record. All I Can Do is on this, and a few others.
The title track, one of the best Cars songs ever.
Oh yeah, and then the album opener is also like a big
Let's Go.
Let's Go. Yeah,
wow, 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 wow.
Yeah, exactly. And All I Can Do is actually probably my personal favorite Cars song. It's just like a really groovy, soulful little thing. But anyway, a great band that had a singular style. And finally, among the honorable mentions, who we got?
Yes, Van Morrison's 1974 classic, Vidon or Vidon Fleece. This was the last album of Morrison's golden period that started with 1968's Astral Weeks. And those 2 albums are appropriate bookends because Vidon Fleece essentially is Astral Weeks Part 2. With that mystical, mysterious, jazzy folk rock that Astral Weeks pioneered. Vidon Fleece is very much picks up where Astral Weeks left off. It is a gorgeous record. It is one of Van Morrison's 3 or 4 greatest albums. I came really close to like really forcing this into this top 20 list, but then I looked at the others that we put in there and I realized, damn it, I have to leave Van out. But Vidon Fleece is just this immaculate, perfect, like I said, is jazz folk rock, but with like a level of mysticism and mystery that only Van Morrison can put into anything.
Yeah,
really.
I mean, this is basically, Van has had this habit in his career of being moored and being wonderful and then being unmoored and then being moored again. This is when he got moored again following Moondance and Astral Weeks. Very good stuff. Yeah. So there you have our honorable mentions, and we'll get into the top 20 shortly.
On this episode, Chris and I counted down the 20 most underrated albums of the 1970s. On the next episode, we'll examine the career and discography of a band deeply indebted to the heavy metal, progressive rock, and punk rock of that decade. Soundgarden are forever ingrained in music lovers' minds as one of Seattle grunge rock's big four, along with Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains. However, time and modern bullshit, critical revisionism, has rendered them as the most overlooked of the big four. This is unfair considering that they not only predated the other three bands, they arguably had the most distinct and original sound of the four. Join us on the next episode as we uncover Soundgarden, a legacy.
Okay, so here we are, folks, at the cusp of our top 20 most underrated albums of the 1970s. We're right, everyone else is wrong. With that said, Arturo, kick us off with the number 20 album on this list.
Number 20 is Joni Mitchell with Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, her double album from 1977. Now, if you can get past the poor taste album cover of Joni wearing blackface makeup, you'll find one of the richest and most rewarding albums in Mitchell's vaunted discography, coming right after her classic mid-decade trilogy of stylistically eclectic folk rock, Court and Spark, The Hissing of Summer Lawns, and Hejira, and right before she launched headfirst into cheesy traditional jazz pop standards. This album finds her flexing her jazz muscles in a way that complements her brand of a literary folk rock much better. Her first venture into jazz is by far her best, and I would argue this is her last great album until she got infected with the virus that troubled many of the great musical artists of her generation, 80s-itis. The highlights are actually the least jazzy tracks. You have the Afro-Cuban rhythmic stomp of the 10th World and the groove-tastic Afrobeat of Dreamland.
Yeah, so you're not into the 16-minute warbling jazz bit?
No.
That took up all of side 2, by the way.
Yeah.
Interesting to note that Weather Report is all over this record. That was Jaco Pastorius' band. Yes, one of the great jazz bassists of all time is featured prominently on a very good Joni Mitchell record. Go figure.
All right, so now number 19, one that we just squeezed into this list. Chris.
Yes, I love this album. The Talking Heads' Fear of Music from 1979. How can this album be so underappreciated and not be revered at the highest level? More songs about buildings and food came just before Fear of Music. Remain in Light came immediately afterward. Both of those records have been canonized, and this one has left behind at the station. I really don't understand that because it is balls out brilliant. One great song after another with no hiccups. And I hear an unmistakable concept album here, one that floors me. The tightest, grooviest, most upbeat song begins the record, an Afrobeat inflected song called Izimbra. The loosest, darkest, most ethereal, and most barely there song ends the record, the appropriately titled Drugs. And in between, the songs proceed along the path in order, and again, along those bookends, and it grows moodier and stranger and bleaker, and it loses its structure as it goes along, so that by the time we get to the end, there's almost no there. Each song also covers one distinct thing that scares people or makes them paranoid. Whether that's money or urban blight or crime, the afterlife, growing older, societal decay, and yes, drugs. But this is also a really funny record, walking a fine line between tongue-in-cheek and morbid, and between cool and weird. I dare you to listen to the 3 Talking Heads albums listed here in succession. 1, you'll experience no drop-off in quality, and 2, I think this one will stand out more than the other 2, even if you think this one isn't the best. It is, or at least should be, the most memorable of the bunch. I think it is the best. It's clearly my favorite, and it's one of my 10 favorite albums of all time.
Yeah, I love this album too, and I think it's great, but it falls just short of all time classic. The reason why, very quickly, all I'm going to do is I'm going to quote from quite possibly the most quoted person in this entire podcast. That is the dean of music journalism, Robert Christgau, from his 1979 review in the Village Voice.
Hello, Bob.
Quote, yeah. I hope he listens to our podcast at some point because
Yeah.
we really quote him a lot. I do, at least.
Yes,
Right.
you do.
Quote. And the pocket review, his pocket reviews are really short, so it's okay. David Byrne's celebration of paranoia is a little obsessive, but like they say, that doesn't mean somebody isn't trying to get him. I just wish material as relatively expansive as Found a Job or The Big Country were available to open up the context a little. That way, a plausible prophecy like Life During Wartime might come off as cautionary realism instead of ending up in the nutball corner with self-referential fantasies like Paper and Memories Can't Wait. And although I'm impressed with the gritty weirdness of the music, it is a little narrow, a little sweetening might help. I kind of agree with that last bit. A little sweetening might help.
Yeah, well, but that's the reason that I like it, is because it is, it's got that kind of icy, detached. Like I said, it's not their most sardonic record, but I think it's their most pointed record, and so
Yeah.
I kind of like that leanness. That really speaks to me. But Bob, I understand where he's coming from there. Yeah, no, there isn't the Big Country on this record, and there's not a once in a lifetime. I'll give it that, but it does have Life During Wartime. I'll give it that. So,
all right,
moving on.
Yes, number 18 on the 20 most underrated albums, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Second Helping from 1974. As you could imagine, it's their second album. Their debut album from a year earlier is the one that lands on most best of all time lists. But this is the album that has Sweet Home Alabama. It also has the revved up honky tonk of Call Me the Breeze, the best J.J. Cale cover ever recorded.
Absolutely.
It also has the crunchy riff monster Working for MCA. It also has the crushingly tender The Ballad of Curtis Lowe, which proves that Ronnie Vanzant could write touching odes to the downfallen as well as the best country music writers. I would say this is their last truly great album before they got formulaic and started to rest on their laurels.
I don't know about that. I think Street Survivors is pretty strong, because Steve Gaines is such a great player, so he added to the band. Yeah, this is a really strong record. This is one of those, not quite like Pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd. It's not quite an album where if you haven't heard it, yes, you have, because of classic rock radio. Yeah. But a lot of this stuff, just remember, Don't Ask Me No Questions is on this record too. Really good song. And so, yeah, yes, an album that has Sweet Home Alabama on it is underrated. We assure you that it is, and it's just really great. And I agree with you, by the way, on Call Me the Breeze. That's probably my favorite Alan, besides Freebird, obviously, my second favorite Alan Collins solo ever. That guy could shred, and he was pretty much a Rossington wasn't bad either, but Collins was just a genius soloist, and he gets to let loose here.
All right, number 17. Oh, I love this one too, Chris.
Okay, we're talking about Fleetwood Mac's Tusk from 1979. Now, how do you follow one of the best and most beloved studio albums of all time? By throwing out this weird-ass disjointed curveball. That's part of what makes it so great. The relations between the bandmates were so strained by this point, it seems like they proceeded like they just didn't give a hoot anymore. Or at least Lindsey Buckingham did. My friend and mentor Matty Karras has said, if you remove all of the Stevie Nicks and Christine McVie stuff on the record, it would be perfect. Maybe, but I mostly disagree with that. But anyway, here's Buckingham on this album doing his 3-piece demo jams in his home and otherwise producing the shit out of the Stevie Nicks and Christine McVie songs in the studio. It's a wacky but wonderful record that has perhaps the prettiest moments delivered by each of the three songwriters during this iteration of the band. In order, those would be the chorus to the album opener, the Gaga in Love opener, Over and Over by McVie.
Yeah.
The Buckingham's aching, longing vocals on Save Me a Place, one of the best songs about loneliness I've ever heard. And Stevie Nicks possessing and squeezing tightly to the chords of the first verse on Her Beautiful Child. Tusk is one of rock's great bastard children. It's a twisted masterpiece in its own right.
Yeah, no, with all due respect to your friend Matty Karras, he's full of shit. Listen, Sarah's one of the best songs Stevie Nicks ever wrote. I love Sisters of the Moon. Sisters of the Moon is gorgeous. I mean, it should be the ending track on anyone's album, but here it's only like the ending of disc 1. Disc 2, I mean, I love all the Lindsey Buckingham. I'm a big Lindsey Buckingham fan, but I want to shine a little light on Christine McVie and Stevie Nicks. They deserve it. Never forget that. That's one of the best.
That's a great song.
That's one of the best McVie compositions ever.
Yeah.
Honey High is great. McVie was an underrated songwriter.
Yeah,
she really was.
Yeah, McVie stuff on this record is immaculate. Like Over and Over is just, that's my favorite of her songs. It's just gorgeous.
Yeah, Tusk is amazing.
Yeah, and if there are bombs, the one or two throwaways on it are Stevie songs, but come on, Beautiful Child, Sarah, and a few others on there. And again, I do understand Maddie's point. The Lindsay stuff is just kind of jaw-dropping in its kind of simplicity and rawness, but some of those songs are just amazing. In addition to Save Me a Place, What Makes You Think You're the One?
Yeah.
And then there's a couple of songs there that I suspect, there's other critics have speculated, must have inspired Prince, because it's got that little bit of kind of jangly, kind of funky, weird kind of stuff that Prince did in the early 80s. So imagine that, Lindsey Buckingham leading a road to Prince. It happens.
It happens. And what also happens is that an album by one of the biggest bands of all time is actually underrated. This leads us to number 16, Led Zeppelin 3 from 1970. Couched right between the groundbreaking Led Zeppelin 2 and the epic, monumental Led Zeppelin 4, this is the Zeppelin album that people tend to forget. It's hard to call any album that has Immigrant Song and Since I've Been Loving You underrated. but this album just never gets mentioned enough when canonical Zeppelin albums are put under the microscope. It was a bit controversial with fans at the time of release because of the large number of acoustic folky songs. But man, have you listened to them? Like acoustic Zeppelin is just as mesmerizing and powerful as any of their electric riffarola workouts.
Yeah, Tangerine.
Their variation of the old folk standard Gallows Pole drives with an intensity that most bands couldn't match with electric instruments.
Yeah,
and like you said, Tangerine proves that George Harrison was full of shit when he said in the early 70s that Zeppelin had no ballads. In fact, it is arguably one of the band's 5 greatest ballads. The fact that most of the tracks on this album haven't been played to death on classic rock radio makes this album a fresh and rewarding listen every time you click play.
Yeah, and I'll say this, How the West Was Won, which made my personal list of the greatest live albums ever made, or at least my favorite live albums a million years ago on an early episode of the cast. My two favorite, and I think the two most revealing recordings on that album are the versions of the Immigrant Song and Since I've Been Loving You. The unbelievable power of Bonham's drumming, and the proof that, actually Robert Plant could scream like that on first take. Incredible album. And again, notice our trend here, folks. It's the album between the two canonized records that getting the short shrift. That seems to happen over and over and over again. Not just in the 70s, I think in general, a lot of times that, Very few streaks of as we talk about like 4 album, 5 album, even 3 album streaks that remain in our consciousness.
And albums that get short shrift right after the canonical one. Enter number 15.
Yeah, we're talking Bob Dylan's Desire. Now, in the latest Rolling Stone version of their 500 greatest albums of all time, Lady Gaga's 2011 album Born This Way makes it just barely in the late 400s. Meanwhile, Desire, which had been at 174 on the first 2 versions of this list from 2003 and 2012, falls out completely. Lady Gaga's Born This Way is not a better album than Desire.
No, it is not.
Most people over the age of 30 will agree with that statement. Behold the dangers of recency bias and perhaps inclusion. Maybe a controversial statement, but the voting populace got younger and more diverse and more female. And while, in some ways, To Pimp a Butterfly being at 18 is actually agreeable, but it kind of shows the sign of the times and, the fact that Sgt. Pepper's goes from number 1 to number 16, which, about time. But, okay, so it's not all bad. But in this case, it's horseshit. Now, Desire comes out of Dylan's oft-mocked Rolling Thunder review period, known as much for Dylan's garish stage makeup than his sort of failed ambitions to form his own real band. Because of that, the close proximity to Blood on the Tracks, probably one of the 10 best albums ever made, and because a generation or two of bar patrons who were subject to a nonstop bludgeoning by the Hurricane and constant Saturday night rotation, Desire really doesn't get the props it deserves. It is one hell of a rock record. It's looser than anything he'd done in a decade, and it's the one time he shared most of his songwriting with a collaborator. Here specifically, that is New York theater genius and trained psychoanalyst Jacques Levy. And the songs alternate between the utterly mischievous, as on the 11-minute Rebel Reveille, Joey, and the utterly profound Sarah, the desperate album closer, which is a plea to his soon-to-be ex-wife. And he sometimes achieves both at once. The awesome, beyond comprehension Isis, one of my favorite Dylan songs, which, it has that kind of a little bit like Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, where it's kind of like this funny, weird narrative that is actually pretty profound. The idea of the guy who leaves his true love to go find his adventures, only to figure out that, holy shit, he belonged back there in the first place. And it rocks. Musically, the star of the record is Scarlett Rivera. That is some rock and rollicking violin there. Now, Dylan would not be this good again for 21 years and wouldn't be.
No, he wouldn't.
And he would not be better than this for 25 years. Now, both of those records, Time Out of Mind and Love and Theft, are on that updated RS 500 list I just referenced. Somehow, the stuff he did in The Ditch and during the comeback get more love than Desire. That makes no sense to me, and I'm sure that makes no sense to you too either, there, Arturo.
No, it doesn't. I prefer to listen to this album in a vacuum. And in a vacuum, it's like rockin' folk music is what this is. Hurricane is the angry, punkish folk song that I wish Dylan would have done in the 1960s. It belongs there. For those of you younger or maybe more into recent rock, and if you're into the White Stripes and have seen their live shows or heard their bootlegs, they do a great version of One More Cup of Coffee. The original is on this album. And it also has, what's the other track? Oh yeah, Mozambique, which is this beautifully lush romantic song. One of his lushest songs. Melodically, lyrically, you name it. It's a great song. You have Romance in Durango, where he alternates between English and Spanish lyrics.
Yep.
He's basically writing a mariachi song. And speaking of best of the best, this next album at number 14, I do think is among this artist's best of the best. That is Elton John's Tumbleweed Connection from 1970. This isn't just one of the most underrated albums of the 1970s. It's the most underrated album in Elton's entire discography. And in my opinion, one of his three best, period. He buttered his bread in the 1970s with beautiful ballads, boogie woogie rock and roll, and majestic glam rock. But this is the album that shows where his true roots lay: classic R&B, country, folk, and most importantly, gospel.
Yep.
Heavy on the gospel. These are gospel hymns that exchange God for stories of people settling in the Wild West in the 19th century. Yes, lyricist Bernie Taupin always had a fetish for all things Americana, but Elton wrote music that was sympathetic to Taupin's lyrical vision. Tracks like Amarina, Burn Down the Mission, and Country Comfort have a yearning that just pulls on your soul. It's astonishing that this album didn't sell that well when it was released. It would take another year before Elton started his awesome streak of hit singles. But nevertheless, this album remains one of the jewels in his catalog.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I think the most well-known song on this record is "Madman Across the Water."
No, it's not on this album.
Yeah, it is.
Madman Across the Water is on Madman Across the Water from 1971.
Oh, okay. But it looks like from what I'm looking at on Spotify, it's on this record as
what
the
you're
last
looking
track.
is that there was a primitive version of that song that was included as an outtake or like a bonus track when it was reissued.
Yeah, and yeah, it's definitely not the radio version. It's raw. It's raw, and Mick Ronson shredding
Right.
on it. But it is on it. So it's like basically okay. The most well known composition on it is probably "Madman Across the Water," but and which is funny because like you said, the rest of it is very gospel-y, very country-ish, very more subdued, and it's a great pop record, but it's more subdued than and a little less melodramatic than his other stuff.
Yeah,
I think that's a fair statement.
absolutely. All right. Speaking to maybe not melodramatic, but we're going somewhere completely different. Number 13.
Yeah, we speaking of the parallel universe, this is Funkadelic's "Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow" from 1970. This is where I think George Clinton first kind of thrusts into the consciousness in at least in the mainstream and kind of comes on the map. This is my treadmill album go-to. I play the 10-minute wacky, funky, gnarly, so tweaky it's hard to believe title track over and over again. Which, I mean, you want to talk about like acid rock production with all kinds of weird stuff going on, and one kick-ass riff in the middle of it, and just this really kind of subtle groove, but it's hypnotic as hell. Now, this is what happens when a bunch of trained black R&B musicians from Detroit take a lot of drugs and crank out psychedelic rock. And amazingly, that is exactly what it sounds like, and why this album is so thrilling. With the extended funk and acid soul workouts on this record, and the sheer nastiness and beauty of the next year's Maggot Brain, George Clinton was made. Without this, he never tears off the roof off the sucker for more than 50 people.
Right. Yeah. And this, Prince has always gone on record saying Funkadelic is one of his foundational influences. And you can hear, especially his guitar playing. Eddie Hazel's a huge influence on Prince as a guitar player.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, like Maggot Brain, I can hear Prince, being gestated, on that song. But this album is very underrated because, again, Clinton is more regarded for his Parliament stuff, which Dr. Dre and Digital Underground sampled so heavily in the early 90s. But this is my favorite stuff, this early Funkadelic stuff. It's just great.
Yeah. And continuing in the realm of great R&B soul acts, number 12 is The Temptations, Sky's the Limit. Now, The Temptations will always be known as one of the best and if not the best vocal groups to come out of the Motown factory in the 1960s. They'll justifiably be revered and looked back on for their string of immaculate hit singles from the mid to late 1960s. However, arguably their most interesting music came in the early 1970s when producer Norman Whitfield and writer Barrett Strong combined to give the vocal combo a wider, more expansive sound palette, heavily influenced by the symphonic soul of Isaac Hayes and the R&B funk pop hybrid of Sly and the Family Stone. By the time of this album's release in 1971, internal conflicts within the group meant that only two of the original Temptations were left. So it's tempting, no pun intended, to really call this a Whitfield Strong album. Nevertheless, it's brilliant and one of the most visionary soul albums of the decade. Just My Imagination, later covered brilliantly by the Rolling Stones, was the number one smash hit. But the album's true MO is in tracks like the epic progressive soul of Smiling Faces sometimes, the unresolved tension of the anthemic fuzz guitar driven Umgenza Ze Ulimwengu, and the scorching political funk rock of Ball of Confusion. If any of you are into Michael Kiwanuka, Leon Bridges, or Curtis Harding, this is where they got a lot of their influence from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, for the kind of the modern day retro soul, this is a source. Now, the Temptations, again, fascinating record and fascinating story. This album kind of gets the short shrift because this is during the period where all of those Motown hit makers got a level of freedom. And all of a sudden, the genius stuff, it's like Barry Gordy finally let them free all at the same time. So within, I think a year of each other, you get Music of My Mind by Stevie Wonder, What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, and this record. And so that was a trend. The Temptations were a part of it. But again, with the exception of Just My Imagination, which will never die. The rest of it is sort of, unfortunately, kind of left in the dustbin when it shouldn't be, because Eddie Kendrick and Norman Whitfield and company were really great.
Yeah. All right. This leads us to number 11, a criminally underrated album. Number 11, Chris.
Yeah, very criminally underrated. We're talking about Pink Floyd's Animals, in which Floyd does Orwell's Animal Farm. As it turns out, conceptual stadium-ready guitar and keyboard rock goes a lot better with science fiction and true nihilism than with all that stuff about Syd Barrett losing his mind and going Nazi. So this is my personal favorite Floyd record. It may be Arturo's favorite too, or at least it's up there. I don't know. For me, it's actually between this and Metal, probably my two favorites. Anyway, like a lot of the records on this list, it's the one that sits in between the two in the canon. In this case, those albums are 1975's Wish You Were Here and 1979's The Wall. On this record, Dogs and Sheep suck me in every time I hear them. These are long, winding, adventurous, intense compositions that capture the themes of societal dissolution and madness with real pathos. Really, the only thing that's been kept alive in the above-board Floyd myth from this album is the giant inflatable pig on the cover. Otherwise, we suspect if you're under 40 years old, you probably haven't heard it, or at least haven't spent too much time with it. Go do that, and go do that now.
Yeah, it's not my favorite Pink Floyd album, but I will say this. It is their final good album. It's their last good album.
Well, yeah.
It's after this. This is the last album that they actually really recorded as Pink Floyd, because it's after this album that Roger Waters' ego ran amok, and he took over just maniacal control of this band. And I've never been a fan of The Wall except for a handful of songs. I actually kind of hate that record. I find it offensive. It's a whiny, rich, spoiled rock star complaining about being famous and having the audacity to compare it to, like, being Hitler in Nazi Germany and controlling minions. Fuck you, Roger.
But it is David Gilmour's finest moment. But
yes, as a guitar player, sure. Yep. But Animals is the last album where Pink Floyd were really Pink Floyd, and they were a unified front. And yeah, Waters is writing most of the material, but he was writing the skeletons of the material. And, Wright and Mason and Gilmour were filling in the rest of it in the flesh, pun intended.
Well, there you go.
But anyway, this is quite possibly Plink Floyd. I mean, they were a progressive rock band at this point. This is them at their most proggy.
Yes, it is.
And usually that's a bad thing coming from me because I hate most progressive rock. But Pink Floyd and another band that we're going to mention later are the acceptable faces of prog rock, in my opinion. And this is their last great album.
There's always a good time to be found within the Curmudgeon Rock Report's Curmudgeonly community. That is our invite-only private Facebook group that Arturo and I launched in December. So far, it's been a spirited romp through this podcast's decidedly bent worldview, and as it turns out, through those of our members as well. Now, is Iron Maiden a good example of a band that blended muso mastery and pop accessibility to an acceptable degree? Well, one of our members sure thinks so, and we gave him the safe space to do it, damn it. If bold opinions and thoughts and passionate defenses of rock and roll are your jam, then the Curmudgeon Rock Report's Curmudgeonly community is for you. Come find us, and we will probably let you in. That was the first half of our list, and now let's get, the bottom half anyway. Now let's get to the top half. We're coming around the bend here. We're at number 10. Arturo, what is our number 10 most underrated album of the 70s?
From one gigantic British prog rock band to one slightly less big prog rock band. King Crimson and their album Red from 1974 is at number 10. Now, let me put it clear if I haven't made it clear before. I'm not a fan of progressive rock. I can take Yes in small doses, maybe 3 songs, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer in even fewer doses, maybe 1 song.
Yeah.
But to me, King Crimson were always the acceptable face of British prog rock, along with Floyd. And they were at their best when they were reduced to a bass, drums, guitar trio and forced to abandon guitarist Robert Fripp's infatuation with classical music affectations. Very guitar heavy, complex, but not so complex that it alienates the listener, and full of appealing changes and passages that aren't meant to show off the musician's dexterity. Red is the final album of Crimson's original incarnation, and hands down one of the 10 greatest albums to ever come out of the progressive rock movement. It was also one of Kurt Cobain's favorite albums. So if it was good enough for Kurt, it's good enough for a couple of curmudgeons who named their podcast after a Nirvana B-side.
Well, yeah, there you go. Red is practically a metal song, like a punkish metal song, and then of course you've got Starless. I mean, those are probably the 2 standouts. And yeah, like you said, this is the one record. Now, most folks will know that 21st Century Schizoid Man is King Crimson's most famous song,
right?
Forever immortalized in the hip hop canon by Kanye West, and I think his best song, Power. But yeah, this album's still underrated because, again, I think that the whole combination of them between King Crimson and Genesis and Gentle Giant and some of those albums, I mean, it got such a, rock snobs love to piss on prog rock. So this album kind of gets lumped into that sometimes, which it shouldn't because it's the good one.
Right, exactly. All right. So speaking of goodness, sweet goodness, number 9.
Yes, very sweet goodness. We're talking about Emmylou Harris's Quarter Moon in a 10-Cent Town from 1978. Emmylou Harris is most famous as the pretty voice in folk rock and country and western harmonies of other artists' songs.
Right.
She worked most famously with Graham Parsons on GP and Grievous Angel. She joined Neil Young on his ballad Star of Bethlehem. She plays Evangeline along with the band in The Last Waltz, and she crooned, again, One More Cup of Coffee with Bob Dylan. But Harris was a hell of a front woman in her own right, as she proved most clearly on this record. After a few previous solo albums that are most known for covers of Parsons and Hank Williams and Beatles songs, here she flips the script and gives the work of contemporary country songwriters their initial fame. A couple songs by Jesse Winchester and Rodney Kroll, but the best song on here is To Daddy, which is Dolly Parton's darkly comedic ode to her mother, which admires Mama's strength in quietly enduring Daddy's BS, and then adds a Fantasia where she gets to leave the guy gloriously behind once the kids are older. Dolly recorded her original version in 1976. However, that did not see the light of day for nearly 20 years. So Dolly, in her version, she kind of hams up the presentation a little bit. Harris keeps it much more muted. She gives it a quieter, more somber treatment, and driven by her awe-inspiring yelp of an Appalachian-bred singing voice, performs it in a much lovelier way. Quarter Moon in a 10-Cent Town is a bit of a lost country classic. Now's the time to rescue it.
Yeah, she may be my favorite all-time female voice in American music, and I think this is, forget about underrated, I think it's her best album, period. It's her most perfect record. Everything works. I love One Paper Kid. I Ain't Living Long Like This, which I believe is a cover of someone else. Most of her songs are covers.
Most of her songs, but she never wrote her songs. And that's Jess Winchester, who's a American draft dodger who ran to Canada. And actually that became a hit for Waylon Jennings a couple of years later. His version is great. So I mean, for all of you out there who've heard of Emmylou Harris, start with this album and then go backward if you want. Yeah, and I guess, well, her most famous moment in the sun was when she joined Dolly Parton and Linda Ronstadt for the album Trio. Right. Of course, she was the third chick because the other two were two of the biggest female stars of all time. Right. That's too bad because she's just great.
Right. All right. Speaking of great, it only gets greater, baby. Number 8, most underrated album of the 1970s. Deep Purple in Rock from 1970. Now, Deep Purple Mach 2 is the term given to the second iteration or the second lineup of Deep Purple with Ian Gillan on vocals. It's known as the definitive Purple lineup, and they lasted from 1970 to 73, releasing 4 studio albums. Understandably, Machine Head from 1972 is the one commonly viewed as the best of the bunch because it has the all-time classic rock staples, Smoke on the Water, Highway Star, and Space Truckin'. You know that one.
Yep.
Space Truckin'. That one, right? However, that album, Machine Head, is actually padded with some schlocky shit, unfortunately. Deep Purple in Rock is the much better, more coherent, more consistent, more inspired record. And inspired indeed, as this is the album where the band were effectively reacting to the atomic bomb of heavy rock from a year ago that saw the release of the first 2 Led Zeppelin albums. Speed King is vintage Purple at their bombastic best. The breakneck speed metal of Flight of the Rat practically invented Judas Priest.
Yep.
And Child in Time is a gorgeous, epic power ballad that proves that Gillan could belt it out with the best metal singers ever. This album should be on anyone's list of greatest heavy metal albums of all time.
I agree, and it's definitely proto metal. I mean, it's ground floor for, like you said, what became Judas Priest and some of the British stuff. But I think just in general, the genre. I mean, they're right there because Paranoid came out the same year, right?
Paranoid came out around the same time. Yeah, no, Paranoid came out a little after this one. What came out around this time is the first Black Sabbath album.
Yeah, there you go. So it's right there. I agree with Child in Time. Wonderful metal power ballad with some unbelievable high range stuff
Yeah.
from Ian Gillan. It reminds me of that early episode of South Park where the guy hits the note on "Loving You" to makes the stadium blow up.
Yeah.
It gets up there. Pretty admirable stuff. Yeah, this album is fucking awesome and really pretty perfect for sure. And Flight of the Rat is great too. Yeah, for people who don't really like Judas Priest, this is like bearable Judas Priest.
Yeah. All right. And speaking of like ridiculous proto metal, number 7.
Yes, we couldn't just limit. We're kind of cheating here. We're going to cover kind of 3 records in one fell swoop. This is the early album streak of Queen, specifically the self-titled debut from 73, and then from 74, Queen 2 and Sheer Heart Attack. 2 words can ably sum up this string of albums: glammy and hammy. Their supreme reign over pop's dominion effectively started with Bohemian Rhapsody in 75 and ended with Radio Gaga in 84. The stuff before it, though, is usually treated as an add-on to the story. Well, we're here to announce that this stuff ain't an add-on to nothing. This is some masterfully complex, entertaining, winky, cheeky space rock. Vocals that seem to be overdubbed 200 times over. Layered lead guitar magic from Brian May, campy ballads like Killer Queen, which is from Sheer Heart Attack, mix in without seams alongside spaced out magically strange epics like White Queen, As It Began, and its counterpart, The March of the Black Queen, both from Queen 2. And they also propel an early bona fide anthem into being on their self-titled debut, which is the chugging, earnest Keep Yourself Alive. These 3 albums are all great and way, way, way underrated. For what it's worth, W. Axl Rose, back in 1989, proclaimed that Queen 2 was one of his go-to albums, along with Nevermind the Bollocks and by the Sex Pistols and Always Would Be. Now, seeing how that weirdo proceeded with life, maybe that shouldn't be a surprise. Still, it's a solid endorsement of the album and of early Queen in general.
Yeah, Queen 2 also has 7 Seas of Rye, one of their first big hit, at least in the UK and in Europe. It has Ogre Battle, one of my favorite.
Yeah,
balls to the wall, just stupid, silly, but awesome. Monolithic swords and sorcery. Heavy metal anthems. It's got Father to Son, which I've always liked. The Fairy Feller's Master Stroke. Coming from the mouth of Freddie Mercury, that's saying something. Not everyone loved it. Would you like to hear Robert Christgau's 5-word review of Queen 2?
Sure.
Wimpoid, royaloid, heavoid, android void.
Okay, that's kind of perfect. God bless you, Christgau. Christgau at his best is like the greatest writer of rock and roll of all time. So thank you for continually bringing in Bob's best stuff. And moving on, we go from British lads to Mexicali goodness and awesomeness.
Yes, number 6, Santana with Santana 3 from 1971. Now, the first 2 Santana albums, the self-titled one and Abraxas, get all the praise and had all the classic rock radio hits. It's unfortunate, though, that this album, the 3rd and final album with the original Santana band lineup, gets overlooked because, as great as the first 2 albums are, this is the one that solidifies them as the musical force of nature that they really were. There were problems within the band at this time due to several members dealing with drug addictions, but you wouldn't guess that by listening to the record. Whereas the first 2 records ebbed and flowed with varieties in tempo and mood, the 3rd album has this relentless drive and momentum, especially from Toussaint L'Ouverture onward, that is befitting of the visionary blues, rock, jazz, salsa, Afro-Cuban hybrid that they created. Later throughout the decade, Santana would get lost down the jazz fusion rabbit hole a little too much, but Santana 3 is a testament to the hottest and arguably the most innovative band to come out of the 1960s San Francisco scene.
Yeah, I agree with that latter statement. This band was ridiculous at its best, and there's just a lot of just great like workout stuff on this record. Strange but true. The founders of Journey are in this band at this time. But man, good stuff. Strangely enough, this album also includes "No One to Depend On," which is one of their more reliable radio rock staples. But yeah, the rest of it, like you said, from Tucson La Overture on, is just like it's not a jam. It's actually deliberate. I mean, you can't call it a jam. You can actually probably see Santana putting a board, like, putting the notes, the note boards together. Just really great stuff, and good call for it to be on this list.
Yeah. All right. So that brings us to number 5, an album that we have spoken about in length, but we can't get enough of it. We're going to talk a little bit about it again. Number 5.
Yes. Richard and Linda Thompson's Pour Down Like Silver. Now, we cover the making of this album, Pour Down Like Silver, pretty extensively on that episode there, where we did a retrospective of Richard and Linda Thompson's career. But we really didn't take the time to tell you that, gosh darn it, this album is ridiculously underrated. It's actually hard to find out there. Compiled YouTube playlists are your best bet to retrieve this record nowadays. We should reiterate here that pulling off the feat of releasing an album of ambiguously and simultaneously spiritual and romantic songs right under the nose of the watchful leaders of London's local Islamic Sufi community is quite amazing, as are the songs and their spare but intimate recordings. The highlight for me will always be the intense, hypnotic 8-minute splendor and wonder of Night Comes In. In a catalog full of gems, this may actually be the brightest one that Richard and Linda ever pumped out.
Yeah, there's not much I can add to this. I mean, my God, I mean, I said a lot about this in our Richard and Linda episode. It's their of the Linda albums that Richard made. This is the sparsest and probably the most soulful of the whole bunch because it's the most spiritual one, which is why he made it sparse and really minimalist. Whereas a lot of people would think, well, I'm making an album about God. Whoa, over the top with arrangements, over the top with vocals and instruments. No, Richard and Linda do the opposite. If you're doing something about God, it has to be humble.
Yeah, and Streets of Paradise is actually more humble than it sounds and is an incredible rock song and album opener. So that's the other one. So check that one out, and also check out the next record, which is the third and most underregarded album of Bowie's Berlin Trio.
Right. This is the fourth most underrated album of the 1970s, David Bowie's Lodger from 1979. Now, the Berlin Trilogy is Bowie's series, for those of you who don't know enough about Bowie, and you should. It's his series of albums recorded with Brian Eno in the mid to late 1970s that may very well be the absolute peak of Bowie's artistry and innovation. Of the two albums from 1977, Low and Heroes, the former, Low, is regularly cited as one of the greatest albums of all time, with irresistible angular art rock on side A and lush, gorgeous synthesizer instrumentals on side B. Remember, this was the era of vinyl.
Yep.
The latter album, Heroes, was basically Low Part 2, but contained the title track, Heroes, one of Bowie's greatest and most enduring songs. However, Lodger is the one in the trilogy that gets usually forgotten, and it's a damn shame because the songwriting is actually better on this one than on the other two. It eschews the formula and format of the first two albums for weird, quirky, oddly catchy and wildly eclectic art pop. From the alien rhythms and North African backing vocals that power African Night Flight to the freaky deaky reggae meets Turkish pop of Yassassin, to the mutant funk of DJ, to the campy romp of Boys Keep Swinging, whose chorus melody, by the way, Blur stole for their 1997 song MOR, to the intense dance floor workout of Look Back in Anger. Gee, was Noel Gallagher referencing this song when he wrote "Don't Look Back in Anger"?
He was like referencing every song from Britain between like 1965 and 1978 or 79.
No shit. In any case, Lodger is Bowie's most consistently rewarding and compelling album, simply due to the fact that it's one of his most unfairly ignored. I personally rank it among his 5 best.
Yeah, a couple of things to note about Lodger. First, album opener "Fantastic Voyage" and "Boys Keep Swinging" are the same song. Like literally the same music. Just done at a different pace and slightly different melody. So that's a neat trick. And also worth mentioning, Brian Eno didn't officially produce this record, but was.
I thought he did.
No, I think Visconti had the production credit on all 3 of the Berlin records, but Eno was involved. As an advisor and arranger and other capacities. That said, I don't think it's a coincidence that Lodger and Fear of Music sound very similar.
Yeah,
they have the kind of same aesthetic and kind of same grooves. I think. This album is on a par. I mean, obviously, Fear of Music is just a personal favorite, but I think that the best stuff on any of these records, both those records, are probably DJ and Red Money. Just some really great stuff there. And then always worth mentioning that Carlos Alomar was really on a roll at this point, too, as his guitarist. So there you go.
Yeah. All right. So this leads us, we're getting to the end. Number 3, the third most underrated album of the 1970s.
Another personal all-time favorite of mine, Al Green's The Bell album from 1977. Al Green, the legend that he is, said goodbye to soul and R&B ostensibly for good in 1977 with The Bell album, by making perhaps the best R&B album of the late 1970s.
Yeah.
Green, you see, had recommitted his life to Jesus Christ after a truly horrible 1974 incident in which his girlfriend poured boiling grits down his back as he was in his shower and then immediately shot herself to death back in the bedroom. I probably would have leaned on the Lord too after that. So 3 years later, the man who would soon be known as Reverend Al Green, on his own and without longtime collaborator Willie Mitchell, gave us this last astonishing volley coming from one of the true giants of that era. The title track, simply put, is one of the greatest popular music songs ever written. Dreamy, sexy, wide-eyed, joyous, contemplative, drums squarely in the middle of the mix, Al's voice reaching its highest register multiple times, and all the while he's telling the object of his desire that God wins the battle in a rout. If you don't listen closely, you'll miss this. Belle is rhythm and blues herself. Al is the Holy Spirit seeking entry into R&B's sinful heart. The whole thing is incredibly moving, as is the rest of the record, which is not as explicit in its Christian worldview as Belle, but is nevertheless gorgeous, upbeat, and above all else, hopeful. I especially enjoy I Feel Good. One thing to note is that the beat on this record and the drums are just consistently great. And also, Al Green plays most of those bluesy guitar licks himself. Wow.
Yeah.
I love this album, and you should too.
I love it as well. It's I think it's one of Green's 2 best albums. This one and Call Me.
Yes.
The fact that he plays all the guitar is what really surprised me the most. He's not a virtuoso guitar player, but his guitar playing is just good enough that it really helps it here a lot. All right, I'm gonna do my third Robert Christgau quote.
There you go.
To
Go
back
ahead.
this up for the Bell album. And this is in 1977 when he wrote it. Since 1975, Green has been making albums on which 2 or 3 real songs were supplemented by material so vague and unpredictable it almost announced itself as filler improvised in the studio, which is not to say I didn't find much of it hypnotic. Now, on a self-produced album focused around his own frequently acoustic guitar, the filler comes front and center with new assurance and perhaps even its own formal identity. The real songs themselves, his best in years, sound improvised in the studio. And more than ever, it all holds together around Green's agile rhythm, dynamics, and coloration, and his obsession with the soul-body dualism at the heart of the genre he now rules unchallenged. Of course, now being 1977.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. I mean, let's just put it this way: Al, before he became the Reverend and did gospel full time, left on top.
Yep, absolutely.
He was at the. Well, even though I think "Call Me" is one of his best records and one of the best albums of all time, this album might be his grandest accomplishment for the reasons that I talked about, because of its positivity, but also again, just Bell, unbelievable, blows me away.
Yeah.
So,
all right. Now we go from someone who was down with God to someone who was not down with God.
not in any way, shape, or form.
The number 2, the second most underrated album of the 1970s, Lou Reed, my man, Coney Island Baby in 1976. Now, here we go. To explain this album, you need context. Context is key in understanding this record. Lou Reed had huge breakthrough success with 1972's Transformer album. That's the one that has Walk on the Wild Side. And 2 best-selling live albums, Rock and Roll Animal from 74 and Lou Reed Live from 75. However, Reed at this time was becoming very unhappy with how his record label, RCA, was marketing and promoting his studio albums. The Bob Ezrin produced Berlin from 1973, while A Beautiful and Powerfully Moving Record, is a concept album about a drug-addicted prostitute who loses her kids to the authorities and eventually kills herself.
Oh, joyful stuff. Joyful stuff.
Not quite something to sell to a mainstream audience, and naturally it flopped. His 1974 album, Sally Can't Dance, was a commercial hit at first. At number 10, it was his highest-selling charting album ever, but it was ravaged by the critics and soon fell off the charts very quickly. Personally, I love that record, but I know I'm alone on an island with that one. Anyway, knowing his RCA contract was finishing soon, and knowing that RCA would release anything he put out, Reed perversely committed one of the most blatant acts of career suicide in rock history, and undoubtedly the biggest fuck you to a record label an artist has ever given. This is called Metal Machine Music.
Oh, yeah.
Released in 1975, it was a double album of grating guitar noise and feedback on a continuous, obnoxious loop. Nope, this record didn't sell either. Proof that Metal Machine Music was nothing more than Reed fucking with his label came in the fact that just 3 months after the album's release, Reed was back in the studio to make his last album for RCA, an album that would become or be his sweetest, cleanest, clearest, most commercially appealing album of his career to date, Coney Island Baby. Now, before anyone starts to accuse Reed of watering his sound down or selling out, consider this. When he was in the Velvet Underground, their final album, Loaded, was intended to be as commercial and radio-friendly as possible. The result was one of the greatest, most riveting, most poetic rock and roll albums ever made. The lesson is simple. Lou Reed doing effortless, unabashedly mainstream music is better than most artists' grand statements. Or, as Reed himself once said, quote, "My week beats your year."
There you go.
Coney Island Baby finds the notoriously cantankerous Reed alternately at his most romantic, his funniest, his most irreverent, his most charming, and his most open-hearted. I guess being in love can do that to someone. And Reed was very much in love at this time. And as he was seeing a transgender woman named Rachel Humphreys. The breezy mid-tempo sway of Crazy Feeling opens the album with a declaration of its romantic intent. But this being Lou Reed, it's no simple love song. Even Blissful Romance is given a multi-dimensional quality and insight into both partners' minds. Charlie's Girl lopes along with a catchy riff reminiscent of some of the best tracks from Loaded. She's My Best Friend is actually a Velvet Underground leftover and one of the most yearning love songs Reed ever wrote. Kicks is the only track where Reed shows his dark side, a rambling, jazzy groover about a serial killer. She's My Best Friend is actually a Velvet Underground leftover and one of the most yearning love songs Reed ever wrote. Kicks is the only track where Reed shows his dark side, a rambling, jazzy groover about a serial killer whose point of view shifts back and forth between first and second person. Reed's sardonic humor comes up in the campy, almost porn music of Gift, where he very tongue-in-cheekily brags about his masculinity. Ooh Baby is a multiple character vignette of scumbag, down-and-out New Yorkers, made all the more hilarious by one of the most delightfully corny sing-along choruses in Reed's entire catalog. Nobody's Business is the kind of hook-filled mid-tempo rocker that Reed could toss off in his sleep. The title track is also the final track, and its open declaration of love serves as a bookend, along with the first track, A Crazy Feeling. Reed conflates his love for his partner with his love for the school he attended as a child. And while that may be awkward in most songwriters' hands, in Reed's treatment, the starry-eyed emotion makes the connection inevitable and logical. Coney Island Baby is hands down Reed's most beautiful and affecting record, and the sincerest expression of the romantic and loving soul he's rarely attributed to having. Easily one of his 2 or 3 best albums as a solo artist.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a really great record. I don't really have much to add other than a slightly funny story that I once made love to a woman to Coney Island Baby.
Really?
Song. Yeah, it's actually a sexier song than to get your groove on than you would think.
Nice.
This was in my pre-marriage days, everybody. So yeah, this was. But that was an interesting experience. So let us move on. You covered that album very well, and now we come to number 1 on the list. Drum roll, please. Okay. Weirdest drums ever. Here we go. We're talking about Steely Dan's Countdown to Ecstasy from, I believe, 74, correct?
73.
73. Okay. So Arturo and I tend to differ on a lot of things. That includes some of the entries on this list. Marginally, mind you, but enough to spark some spirited agitation. But there is one thing the two of us are absolutely in agreement with. Countdown to Ecstasy is Steely Dan's best album. Not Aja, not Katie Lied, not Gaucho, as an increasing number of hardcore Steely Dan acolytes actually believe. No, it's this one, their second record. Back when they were still a real 5-man band and not an ever-turning payroll consisting of Los Angeles' best session musicians. Back when, at their essence, Steely Dan was a guitar band and was one of the best guitar bands that ever existed. Seriously, Skunk Baxter and Denny Diaz had magic fingers. That is Skunk on the rockabilly-influenced solo to Bodhisattva, and that is Denny on the band's first real hint of jazziness that was to come, Your Gold Teeth. The guest spots here are very few. The most notable pinch hit is Rick Derringer's slide guitar work on the amazing and angry as hell Showbiz Kids. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. Aja does deserve its props. It is unified, exquisite, and wonderful in its own studio refracted light. But to us, the Dan accomplishes something similar here and does it way, 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 way more organically. Even the most studio-rific thing on it, the album's closer, King of the World, has genuine soul that you just can't fake or capture in take number 114, Below Its Belly. So yeah, we are in the minority here, probably in the extreme minority, but to hell with it. We're wrong, we're right, and everyone else is wrong. Countdown to Ecstasy, Therefore and Forevermore, is the most underrated album of the 70s. I don't get why this is considered, this should universally be considered one of the 50 greatest rock albums ever, and one of the top albums of the 1970s, but it is slept on. Why?
Why? Because it didn't have the hits that Can't Buy a Thrill had. It didn't have the hits that Pretzel Logic had. I mean, yeah, it didn't have the hits. So fucking what?
Yeah.
Although every now and then on classic rock radio, you'll hear Bodhisattva.
Yeah.
Every now and My Old School, at least when I was living in Florida
Yeah,
a long time ago.
Yeah, you still get Bodhisattva in My Old School. I mean, Bodhisattva is probably my favorite song on it.
Yeah.
I would say as far as best, it's probably either My Old School or King of the World, which is just an incredible song. But no, just from beginning to end is just basically perfect. It's Fagen and Becker at their most focused and gnarly. And this is before they decided that they were going to try to make the greatest album ever made every time out. And at this point, they were still just rocking balls.
And I will end this. I've done it 3 times already. Fuck it. I'm going to do it for a 4th time. I'm going to quote Robert Christgau again.
Go figure.
In his 1973 review. Very short. They're all short reviews. With the replacement of lead singer David Palmer, who fit in like a cheerleader at a crap game, by composer, pianist, conversationalist Donald Fagen, who looks like he just got dressed to go out for the paper, they achieve a deceptively agreeable studio slickness. Perfect licks that crackle and buzz when you listen hard. Grassroots harmonies applied to words that are usually twisted. Not only does Bodhisattva come on like a jazzed up rock around the clock, it shines like China and sparkles like Japan. But somehow, I don't think Fagen really intends to hold hands with an enlightened one, not even out of base curiosity. And now, ladies and gentlemen, fellow curmudgeonly listeners, we go into the vault. And into the vault, Chris and I, each episode, pick 2 albums from the past, whether it's the distant past or the recent past, where albums that we think are deserving of attention and revisionism. Of course, our episode is about the most underrated albums of the 1970s. So, of course, Chris and I each picked an album that we both think albums that we both think are very, very underrated. Not among the most underrated albums of the 1970s, but still worthy of some revisionist listening due to either them being really great or them just being really fucking weird. The latter is what I'm going with. From the deepest, darkest, most obscure depths of the vault, I present to you, the curmudgeonly listeners, and to you, Chris, British folk singer Mark Fry's beautiful yet oddly haunting 1972 acid folk classic, Dreaming with Alice. Now, imagine, if you will, a celestial wonderland patterned after, well, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, where mandolin men walk narrow streets with Norman soldiers from ye olde England, benevolently giving flowers to Christopher Columbus while playing their lutes, their flutes, and their sitars, all while wearing silken lace. Meanwhile, there is an unsettling unease in this panacea as witches gaze into your window, urging you to march on down an uncertain path to a home you never knew. Or maybe Mark Fry was just a guy who smoked a lot of pot and listened to way too much Donovan. In any case, my little soliloquy there referenced the names of all the songs on this painfully pretty delight of an album. A more cynical person would say Fry's brand of hippy-dippy acoustic reverie was out of fashion by 1972, and while that may be correct, being out of step with the times never hurt Creed doing grunge in the electronica year of 1997.
True enough.
And if that shitty band could be huge, then Mark Fry deserves not just a pass for being a step out of the times or out of step with the times, but an appropriately revisionist listen as well. Lute and Flute is so fucking corny that you have to admire Fry's courage to even write such a song. The Witch is probably the standout track on the album, with its genuinely disturbing imagery of a witch beckoning you at your window to come on home. With its driving bongos and sitar arrangement, it's akin to Nick Drake on a bad acid trip. Mandolin Man is an 8-minute folk rock jam with shifting time signatures, odd breaks, and some downright groovy acoustic guitar wizardry and a wah-wah pedal electric freakiness. Truly an out there diamond in a very deep rough. Mark Fry's Dreaming with Alice is worthy of anyone interested in spaced out, slightly psychedelic, richly textured, bizarro folk music.
Yeah, the albums like this annoy me. I mean, yes, I mean, I've known of this album for a while, but never really dove into it until this week. For what it's worth, pressings of this album are so rare. They sell for 5,000 plus pounds in England at auction. They're hard to come by. It is on Spotify, and it is all over YouTube. So, hey, there you go. But yeah, I mean, I'd call this album pretentious, but Mark Fry is a child of privilege that spent a few years traveling around Europe and made his living as a painter. And I'm not even sure it was a living. At least it was a passion. But he's most known as a painter. And with this record, which he recorded, I think in the course of like 3 days, it's basically a bedroom recording in Italy. Yeah. I mean, when you break up your title song into 9 37-second chunks throughout the record, I mean, once or twice is great, but after the 8th one, that gets kind of annoying. The Witch is good, although, like you said, he definitely liked his Donovan. Oh, and speaking of reverence, I like the song Lute and Flute better in its original version, otherwise known as Uncle John's Band by the Grateful Dead. I also liked Down Narrow Streets in its original version as Astral Weeks by Van Morrison. But be that as may, there actually is some pretty stuff on here. Like Down Narrow Streets is very pretty. Song for Wild, A Norman Soldier, those types of things. So, like I said, can't call it pretentious because the guy really was an aristocrat. And, granted, I mean, maybe there's some connection spiritually, at least with Daniel Johnson, the weird guy making kind of lo-fi hissy recordings. But yeah, thank you for taking this out of the vault. You do the public service. Our roles with the vault usually are you do the ones that most people haven't heard of. I do the ones that people have forgotten. That seems to be our division of labor. So good stuff. It definitely worth checking out. Just do yourself a favor. I mean, listen to the first two versions or verses of Dreaming with Alice, and then skip the rest because you'll quickly get it'll agitate you.
Well, the very last track's a kick-ass jam. I like that one. That's a good one.
Yeah. And Mandolin Man is good too. Like I said, it's not a bad record. It isn't a bad record, but again, it's too late to be in the heart of psychedelia, and the Dead obviously was got to be an influence, right? I mean,
sure.
Yeah. Well, but then again, the Dead was an influence on everybody in 1972. Let's face it. They were kind of in the DNA. So, okay. Mark Fry, big ups. You're relevant here in 2022. Now, as I said, I am the one that covers the forgotten stuff. And so on the underrated theme, I am going to take out of the vault an album that is very, very, very fun and deserves your respect. The Eisley Brothers, The Heat Is On. May I present to you the 1975 Black Music Jamboree. If it was cool in 1975, Ron Eisley and his bros captured it on the magnificent The Heat Is On. Not the Glenn Frey song, just to be clear. Now, hell, the first and best song on the thing, Fight the Power, Parts 1 and 2, works as soul, funk, disco, bedroom freaky-deaky groove music, pre-chic black rock and roll, and late period Motown, as if a Jackson 5 single went the way of Frankenstein's monster. I implore you to listen to this song as soon as possible, maybe even right after we finish this episode. Now, less hyperbolically, here's the Eisley Brothers story. The band consists of 5 brothers and 1 brother-in-law from Cincinnati, Ohio. It started off as 3 of them, then it grew to 6 over time, and then from there whittled down to 2 as drug addictions and death hit some of the brothers. Now, they became famous and forever etched into popular music consciousness in the 1960s with genuinely great version of Twist and Shout, and they did This Old Heart of Mine, which is an actual Motown release, released on Motown, and then most famously It's Your Thing, which is probably their biggest hit. Now, those initial songs gave this hit-making machine the license to experiment mightily, and experimentally, and they did all through the 1970s. The most famous of their records from that decade is 3+3, which includes the oft-licensed but never duplicated breezy little rocker, That Lady. Yes, you've heard it over and over and over and over again, and probably like every other movie. But The Heat Is On is my personal favorite of these records. I already gave the long version. Here's the short version. Damn, this thing is fun. Here is a famous, highly regarded band that still doesn't really get its proper due. I mean, they were contemporaries of Earth, Wind, and Fire, Curtis Mayfield, P-Funk, and other top-selling artists. It sucks to finish in the middle of that great of a pack. Even so, Ron and Ernie Eisley especially moved on pretty well from the band's heyday there. Ron scored a duet hit in the 1980s with Rod Stewart, which I believe was a cover of This Old Heart of Mine. And he found his way into several hip-hop videos as this sort of godfather figure in like pimp clothing. Kind of strange. Now, he also, in retrospect, maybe... I don't know if he wants to talk this up as much. He hitched his wagon to R. Kelly, and R. Kelly helped him cash in on that Godfather persona, and produced a big hit for Ron and Ernie as the Eisley Brothers, which at this point they're the only 2 active members of the Eisley Brothers. And this is in 2001, a song called "Contagious," huge hit, and classic R. Kelly template. Sexy R&B. Now, R. Kelly again worked his magic with the brothers on 2003's Body Kiss, which amazingly hit #1 on the Billboard 200 album chart, and also won a Grammy in 2004 for Best R&B Album. The Eisleys were inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1992, and last released an album in 2017 as they were approaching their 80s. Not bad. So check out the Eisley Brothers and start with The Heat Is On. It'll be a sexy time swing party for 1, or hey, why not 2? Yeah, it really is. Fight the Power, one of my favorite riffs of all time. Just kind of this. That's the Eisley Brothers doing bona fide funk. Great stuff.
Yeah, this is a double album in its original format on LP, right? Mm-hmm. I love disc 1 or album 1. It's got all the funk stuff on it. Great stuff from top to bottom. Disc 2's got all this, the smooth, mellow R&B stuff. It's a bit anticlimactic after like the funk fireworks of the of disc 1. But it is overall it is a really strong album. I wish they would have done more funk. I wish they would have like peppered it a little more on disc 2 just in my personal opinion. The on disc 2 or the second album, For the Love of You, parts 1 and 2, it's a really, really great track. But I find Sensuality and Make Me Say It Again, Girl kind of redundant.
Yeah. And it is, but that's closer to what the Eisley Brothers were most known for. It was just kind of orthodox pop hits, but then those sort of slow, sexy jams, which is why I bet back in '75, if you were a fan of black music, of R&B, it must have shocked the shit out of everybody to hear a funk track from the Eisley Brothers after doing so many of those sort of orthodox R&B songs for so long. And not only did they do a funk track, they did one of the best funk tracks ever. I used to own the 4-disc funk box that Rhino released 20 something years ago, and that was featured very prominently on that set. So love this record, love the Eisley Brothers, Ron Eisley, and a grossly underappreciated, towering talent. He has gotten his due, but not enough of it.
Right. Absolutely.
Sure. So, Art, what's coming up next? Oh, and remember, the Curmudgeon Rock Report's Curmudgeonly community on Facebook, invite only. You can find us there, and we're going to implore current members to invite all their friends. We want a bigger party. And hit us up at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com and tell us how you really feel. Now, Arturo, what are we doing next?
Next, we're going to do another legacy episode. We talked about the 1970s and all the underrated albums, as I alluded to in my promo. Our next episode will be focused on the legacy of a particular band very heavily influenced by the rock or the heavy rock of the 1970s. And this is the pioneering Seattle grunge band Soundgarden. And we're doing Soundgarden, A Legacy. And this will be kind of a precursor to the mammoth monster 9-part series that we have planned. And we'll talk about it a little bit more in the next episode, but let it be known that Soundgarden and the sound that they pioneered, or they're one of the bands who pioneered the sound that defined a subgenre, that defined a city, that defined a decade. I'll just leave it at that. And we're going to talk about that.
So here we are at the end of another episode of the Curmudgeon Rock Report. And as we just said, next episode in 2 weeks, we will be focusing on Soundgarden. Here's a bit of homework for you. Definitely check out the band's early catalog before Bad Motorfinger dropped in September of 1991. If you are familiar with it, you will love it again. If you are not, it will be an excellent education. That said, you can always reach us at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com, and definitely check out our Facebook group, the Curmudgeon Rock Report's Curmudgeonly community. You'll definitely dig it. Take care, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.